Well, good morning, folks. Welcome back to 3 Zen. So, this one morning, I got a call from Bill Ferrier, a very dear friend of mine, and he says, I've got an interesting story for you. And I said, okay. So he says, why don't you grab a cup of coffee? So I did. And he proceeded to tell me this story. I said, what's up? He says, we just sent one of our navigators from Mather Air Force Base out in California to Leavenworth. Okay, that's kind of interesting. I said, how do you earn that? And Bill said, it really is a bizarre story. And I said, okay, I've got a little bit of time. Well, it seems this navigator they had in the T-43 squadron was a pilot. Also, he had his private pilot's license, and he had his certified flight instructor license and or certificate, and his instrument instruction certificate, and so forth. And on weekends or his time off, he would work at the Aero Club, teaching guys how to fly light aircraft. And in his mind, he reasoned that since he was actively involved in an Air Force sanctioned club, i.e. the Aero Club, that on Friday afternoons he could wear pilot wings to the bar. Big mistake. So, first time he did that, he got his ass kicked by somebody that didn't really care for it that much, so he stopped doing that. But at any rate, what had happened is one of the pilots in Bill's squadron had come to him and said, listen, he said, I was talking to my dad the other night, and Sunday night, and he said, Dad is a pilot at Delta Airlines. And he said, Dad was doing some interviews, and he told me that they interviewed this guy from our squadron, and they liked his record, and they hired him. And I said, Dad, that guy's a navigator, and not only is he a navigator, he's an asshole. His dad said, no, I saw the records. He said they were pilot records, and he said, I know what I'm looking at, and so forth. Well, then this guy went to Bill or to the DO, I don't know how the chain got started, and told the guy about this nav, and they started looking into it. Now, what had happened is they got this thing all pulled apart and all sorted out. This navigator was a navigator instructor on the T-43, which was based at Mather. That's where we trained guys at the time to be navigators. So his duty was to train as a navigator instructor, and he would fly with the young students, and he also rode in the sims. Well, after the sim period was over, he would grab a little stick time up in the front. Now, T-43 is a 737 in commercial flying. So he'd fly an ILS or another instrument approach until he started to gain some proficiency at it. Then what he did, he took his flight records, and at the time, the only thing that designated between pilot or navigator with respect to flight time was either a P or an N at the top of the page. We would log primary time, secondary time, and so forth, but we didn't log like aircraft commander time or co-pilot time during that period. So what he did, he took his records and he very carefully whited out the N and replaced it with a P. And then he made copies of it. Then he took copies of his flight records with P's across all the top of them, went down to San Francisco and got a check ride with the FAA in the 737 and got a type rating. He probably had to take a little bit of schooling in between, but that was nothing for him because he was real familiar with the 737. So now he comes back with his 737 type rating, and he applies to Delta Airlines. Well, they look over his paperwork, and everything looks copacetic, except for that Sunday night call when that young captain called his dad and got to chatting with him. His dad dropped the dime on this kid. So now they take all this and they go into the DO, Grady. Now, I like Grady. Grady was a friend of mine. He was our ops officer in the 560th when I was there. So they go in and they explain all this to Grady, and Grady is just totally astounded by it. So he calls the kid in and presents everything to him. Well, the kid's busted. He knows it. There's no point in arguing about it. He's busted. So Grady says, all right. He says, why don't you go back to your BOQ room? He said, you're more or less, consider yourself more or less on house arrest. And he said, you just stay in your BOQ room until we figure out what we're going to do with you. And he says, you will not out-process. You will not leave the base. You got it? And the kid said, yes, sir. Salutes smartly, and off he goes. Well, Grady just had an inkling. So he calls up to CBPO personnel, and he says, listen, he says, if this bozo comes in and tries to out-process, give me a call immediately. Hangs up. Well, a short time later, Grady gets the call. He said, Captain Schmuckenfuss, or whoever he was trying to out-process. So now Grady sends the gendarmes after him, the air police. Well, they go up, collect him, and throw him in a slammer. So after a hearing and a court-martial, they brought in all the evidence, and they figured out what he had done. And they decided he needed a tour at Leavenworth, where the military prison at Leavenworth. So after everything was said and done, they packaged him up, put him on an airplane, and with officers, depending on the nature of the crime, you either get hooked up with handcuffs or not. In this case, they just had an escort officer with them. So they're flying to Kansas City for this guy to be taken and delivered to Leavenworth. And they're flying just north of Dallas on the way to Leavenworth. The kid looks out the window and then looks over to his escort officer, and he says, all this is really going to fuck up my interview with American. Oh, jeez. So anyway, they land at Kansas City. This guy gets hauled into Leavenworth, and that more or less is the end of the story. Now, the astonishing thing about this is about maybe 5 years later, something like that, I was a captain at Northwest Airlines, and we're flying along. I'm flying along on a trip with this young kid, nice kid. Flying along with him, we got to chatting, and he told me he'd been at Mather flying T-43s. So I asked him if he knew Bill, and he did. And I said, Bill once told me a very interesting story about this Navigator that thought he was a pilot, actually got hired by Delta and would probably be flying for Delta had not this guy called his dad on one Sunday evening. This kid says, that was me. So talk about a small world. I still can't help. It's an amazing story, but I still can't wonder how many slip through the cracks. Don't know. Don't think I ever will. Don't think you ever will. But at any rate, it makes for a great story this morning. Nice to see everybody.